You're listening to episode 256 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Charles Carstens joins us to speak about his experiences living in Burma in a time of religious and ethnic turmoil. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any of the other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the contributions button. There are many ways you can help which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and it helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. We may shake our heads in sadness or perhaps disgust when we read in the news about some act of violence against one group of people by another group of people. Sometimes religion is a given reason, the public one, the face of an underlying aversion, or perhaps it's an ethnic divide. There may be a sense of judgment, too, about how Buddhism is free from that kind of strife because the practice is so clearly against it. But that's not what's actually happening. Buddhism, too, has its share of those who are subtly and sometimes overtly encouraging acts of aggression and violence against others, in contradiction to what you and I may believe is closer to what Gautama had in mind. It may be so, but the fact remains, groups like the 969 movement are not shining examples of loving kindness. Charlie Carstens is a PhD candidate in the study of religion at Harvard University. His field is Buddhist studies, particularly the pre-colonial Buddhist literary traditions and social histories of Myanmar. Studying 18th and 19th century coronation rituals, his dissertation investigates issues in the study of loyalty, identity, leadership, social order, hierarchy, secularism, ritual, and political economy. Charlie obtained a MTS in Buddhist Studies from Harvard Divinity School and a BA in Economics from Carleton College. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice tranquility. Please, I mean that. Now perhaps more than ever, this is a time to meet aggression with kindness. Our guest today is Charles Carstens. Charlie, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
Very glad to be speaking with you today. And what I'd like to do is just start by having you tell the listeners a bit about your background.
All right. I've been studying Buddhism for quite some time, and it's funny, every time I attempt to remember how the story goes, it changes just a little bit. But I'll do my best to give you the rendition that I seem to be working with lately. So I first encountered Buddhism in a somewhat unusual set of circumstances. I was actually taking an exam for a development economics class in college.
That is a new one. I have not heard that one
Yeah,
before.
that's right. Right. And what the exam featured was a paragraph, an extract from E.F. Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful. And the title of the passage was called Buddhist Economics. And what the passage proposed was this idea that if one were to abide by Buddhist principles, that the way that economic systems might work would be a little bit different. So it was quite surprised, at least not very consistent with the curriculum of the course, but I was intrigued by the proposal. And in the course of my undergraduate studies, I became more interested in considering the question, are there different ways of being an economic person? And Buddhism kept coming out as this radical exception, especially because of its commitment to minimization of consumption. And some would describe meditation practices as a certain kind of attractive production process. So I started, after studying Buddhism a little bit within the classroom, I started traveling to Southeast Asia, and I spent a summer going around to different monasteries, essentially asking the question, how do monks live economic lives? Or is it something completely opposite? Are they, as a human being, a violation of the Western conception of the economic man? And then I transitioned to Sri Lanka, where I stayed for about 6 or 7 months. And I used my time in those places and the research that I had done to formulate some reflections for my undergraduate work. After I graduated, the day I graduated, I started my project of figuring out a way to get to Myanmar. My first day, I did a summer course and I started learning Burmese language, and then I started plotting my way. And my interest in going to Myanmar arose somewhat strangely, because in the course of my travels in Thailand and Sri Lanka, everyone said to me, hey, if you really want to look at a different kind of economic world, go to Burma or Myanmar, because it's a military dictatorship. The West hasn't ruined it yet. So this is what people were telling me, and I had no idea. I didn't know very much about this part of the world. It was very new to me. But anyway, I committed to trying to figure it out. So I moved to Thailand, and I lived in a monastery in Bangkok for a few months, just trying to meet someone who'd ever been to the country. And eventually I gave up and I just flew. And I landed and I was walking down the street, and he said, where can I work? Where can I live? And where can somebody teach me the language? And essentially within about a month, I had set myself up. And I continue in this lifestyle of taking regular lessons for about a year. And then I moved to a monastery and lived there for a year. And then for the next 6 months, I was involved in some relief work because there was a natural disaster there. And at this point, I decided to go to graduate school because I was so entranced by all the experiences I was having and attempting to understand Buddhism that I wanted to think about it better or learn how to write about it. So I decided to go to graduate school, and this was 2008, and I started a master's at Harvard Divinity School, after which I enrolled in a PhD program at Harvard University. I started that program in 2010, and currently I'm in the dissertation phase of my career. And I suppose in the meanwhile, I'm teaching courses about Buddhism in addition to teaching Burmese language at the university.
Wonderful. Thank you for that background. And that lends us into the topic that we're going to explore today, which is some of the religious conflict in Burma. So I'm wondering, Charlie, if you could just give a brief overview of what's the environment, what's the background of this?
This narrative, too, is a bit tough to tell. Essentially, just to jump in, I suppose what people might encounter are reports of interreligious conflict between communities that are identified as Buddhist and Muslim or Indian. There's a bit of ambiguity about where exactly the conflict lies, and that's something we'll go into. Essentially, the way that the narrative goes, it's a little bit unclear in terms of whether the extent to which this precedes the colonial context. Some of the reason for that is that the very concepts of religious identity and community formation were a little bit different there. But what does seem to be clear, at least in terms of how we remember the story of this conflict, is that in the early 20th century, there was a lot of anti-Muslim or anti-Indian sentiment as a result of some of the British colonial practices and a number of different things. So we started having riots in the early 20th century, the most significant of which was in 1938. And then, of course, when the British left by 1962, about a decade later, when the military dictatorship took over, we have a different political climate. Now, the conflict between the communities, as far as we know, wasn't very active, but it's sort of hard to say because we know not very little about the country during this period. But what does seem to be clear is that when we started transitioning through the reform process and at least entering into the 90s, we have reports of riots. The first was in 1997, then 2001, and then pretty much from 2012, we had it almost every year, just reports of riots. And this is occurring in many parts of the country, a lot in the West, in a state called Rakhine State, and I'd say a lot, and many reports also in central Burma. And what usually happens in these riots is that you'll have a large crowd of what seem to be identified as Burmese Buddhists who are either destroying a mosque or attacking a particular person who's often identified as a Muslim. Often the report of the situation describes accusations of Muslim men raping Buddhist women, and that seems to be the cause. So as these riots have been somewhat continuous since 2012, you also, in parallel, have the development of a couple of organizations that are run by Buddhists that seem to be dedicated to organizing in opposition to a perception of a either Indian, foreign, or Muslim threat. The first of which is this movement called 969. It's interesting to just point out the number and what it means. The number itself is a reference to the triple gem and the Anusati remembrance practices of the qualities of the Buddha and the Dharma, the Sangha, the Buddha having 9, the Dharma having 6, and the Sangha having 9. And the leader of this movement is this monk who's been identified as Shinwitra. And generally, he seems to be espousing certain kinds of rhetoric that, again, describes the nature of this threat, often in gendered ways, Muslim men and Buddhist women, and also biological terms. And what I mean by biological is the spread of numbers of the Muslim population or the threats to women's bodies, and as in the cases, the rapes. The language can be somewhat aggressive and provocative, but simultaneously, the way that they just put the rhetoric is that it's about protection, and it's about making sure that the sasana, doesn't become corrupt. They use certain kinds of metaphors for describing the violence. For example, like medicine, if you have a injured or corrupt part of your body, you need to surgically remove it for the greater interest of the health of the body. So there's no, they at least say themselves, there's no explicit calls to be violent. And some of the activities they've been organizing are things like boycotts. So for example, they have these stickers, these 969 stickers, and if you post them above your business, you're marking yourself as a Buddhist, and you're saying to other Buddhists, come shop here. And the idea is that if someone doesn't put it up, or if you actually see one of the markers that's associated with Muslim businesses, which actually is another number, which is a 786, then the idea is that you're not supposed to go in. And in some communities, there's the development of this social pressure saying that, if you see a Buddhist going into a Muslim shop or a shop that's unmarked, then someone might question their loyalty to the tradition. Just to finish, the second organization that's arisen and is currently in a position of prominence is this organization called Mabata, which is an acronym for Amyoda Tatana, or Amyoda Bada Tatana Sound Shao Ye Apue. And what this is an organization, sort of translates to the protection of race and religion. It's a group that's dedicated to that. So again, there's a kind of protection rhetoric. And they arose it seems to be in response to the prohibition of this 969 emblem, which had gained some support because of the economic disruptions. And now this 52-member committee has again, similar to the 969 movement, mobilize certain forms of action which they identify as not necessarily violent, but as protecting themselves. So one of them is that they put forward legislation which has been that seeks to regulate religious conversion, the enforcement of monogamy, population measure controls, and they're also organizing forms of boycott against business. One business in particular called Ooredoo, which is a telecommunications provider, which is affiliated with allegedly, Muslims. So essentially, you have these different Buddhist groups who are attempting to exercise protection and care for their community in these kinds of ways, which they call nonviolent. And the international community is, to some extent, acknowledging, the problems associated with this. Even the Western media, for example, has identified who we were through the leader of the 969 movement as a kind of Buddhist terrorist. And the government, for the most part, it seems a bit unclear to me at least, what's happening on their end. It could be anything from a lot of ambivalence from different members to an inability to actually enact something, even if they wanted to. But actually, in just this month, we actually see the very first rumblings of an attempt to address the situation. So the NLD is developing a bill that's trying to develop laws that protect against hate speech, as well as getting some of the other members of the Sangha to denounce this other organization. So that's currently, I guess, where the general narrative of where this is.
Charlie, have you had the chance yourself to speak with anyone either in the monastic community, perhaps even in those organizations, but I think more so just the general Buddhist populace about this and what for some of us as Buddhists might seem a bit of a stretch of the Dharma?
There's a couple of things I guess I could address how the general conversations have gone, and also just thinking about, how does this connect to something like Dharma? First of all, it's really hard to get a sense of what people feel on this, because I've seen many friends of mine, for example, who have actually said both things. And it's tough as, someone who appears to be Western to have this conversation, because on one hand, they may sort of say, oh, I know you're going to have a liberal perspective on this. So you want to hear something about how it's important for us to, respect all people, nonviolence, and that sort of thing. So I don't know where it's coming from, the extent to which they want to avoid some kind of conflict with me, that there's a kind of proclivity for saying that sort of thing. And then you have the opposite side of things, which, people are also saying, espousing what I would say the common view is somewhat in support of a lot of these measures that are protecting against Muslims. So, you're also not sure if somebody says just the opposite, that, these like measures of protection are important, if they're saying that just because they themselves are afraid of, appearing to be a voice of dissent. So I can say that, I hear at least more often in my encounters, I see people more in support of these measures of protection, but it also seems to be that the climate is such that most people feel this way. So it's hard to sense that, this is really what their position is, or there's more of a concern to be a voice of dissent, which is an important dynamic in the situation that I think we need to keep in mind. So, it's one of the few things that I would really stress about this is that it's hard to sort of to get people to sort of confess. I mean, there's a kind of taboo associated with the kinds of views that you would express yourself when there's a social hierarchy of, people who have views that are more correct than yours if they're more senior than you. So that goes for lay people with the monastics above them. And then when monastics have always monastics senior to them. So this idea of expressing opinion is always a sort of fraught moment. So, but just in terms of the logic behind the defense, I think you're right to sort of bring to bear this question of the Dharma. And from my own experiences, I don't see people bringing up Dharma as a means of justifying these actions. I think more the concern is, and what I hear is that, there's just this population of individuals who are destroying our community. And we have to protect ourselves. So then, there's this discussion that says, the very basis of our ability to live Buddhist lives, engage in Buddhist practices, is being threatened by this source of violence. So I might even get something like there are preconditions for Buddhism to occur. And one of them is being in a safe environment. So when you're not in a safe environment, then, Buddhism, you don't necessarily have the luxury of the Dharma anymore. So I've heard that sort of thing. I also want to say that one of the things that's interesting to me, at least, and this also emerges from my experience of being in the country, when people talk about what it means to be a Buddhist, or when is someone not a Buddhist, I actually don't hear much discussion about things on a doctrinal level or something like Dharma. It's more explicitly put in terms of something like practice. So I have an example that I found somewhat surprising, but I think it really well captures, the situation. And so a friend of mine a few years ago entered a relationship with a Burmese man, and they decided to get married. And according to the legal procedures in the country, there's some, and this is also related to this current conflict, there's some regulation of marriages in cases where there might be religious tradition differences. So this woman was marrying a Buddhist, and she herself identified as Buddhist, but she was a foreigner. So the state needed her to demonstrate that she was a Buddhist. So she went down to this office, and they said, "Okay, you can marry him as long as you're a Buddhist." She's like, "Great. How do I prove that I'm a Buddhist?"
Yeah, what's the legal definition in this country of being a Buddhist?
That's right. So, and I think there was a sort of moment where they didn't know exactly what to do. But what they decided to do is they say, "Okay, you see that Buddhist statue over there? The Buddhist statue, go and bow in front of it and express veneration and respect to the image." And she was so surprised because, she'd been studying Buddhism in all these kinds of ways, was really enamored of the philosophy, and then it was this one really particular act. But actually what she explained to me is there was something ingenious about it, because then you realize that if someone had been regularly performing that bow, you would have a certain kind of graceful motion and the way you actually do it. In the same way, you can tell the difference between someone who is meditating for the first time and has been doing it for 10 years. So then he's like, "Oh, we have a great way of determining whether you've been doing this." So, I think she wasn't the most graceful of bowers, but they seemed to be kind enough. But the sort of lesson behind this is that, what people seem to be concerned with are practices. And so much so that one of the interesting things, at least according to my observations, is that boundaries between religious communities may be more permeable than we think, in the sense that you do see Muslims, for example, going to Buddhist temples and giving donations, or even going to a meditation center. And then when you start to see that those Muslims or Christians or Hindus and those individuals who may identify with those communities are engaging in those practices, Buddhists might say, well, they're pretty much Buddhist, because they're doing what we think is important for being a Buddhist. So bearing in mind what makes a Buddhist, when we go back into this kind of climate of practices, this is an act of violence. So then these people are sort of being made into this religious other through these particular kinds of actions. And then they themselves sort of say, well, we need to protect against it. And of course, we don't like to be violent, but this is what we need to do. So that's one way I might describe the dynamic of how the Dharma is working.
It's interesting that you bring up the case of identity, and that one can be from another tradition and still go to a Buddhist temple, meditation center, whatever, and still be fine with what's happening there. And this comes up a great deal, in particular in Buddhist circles. As a secular Buddhist, I often need to explain, what exactly does that mean? It's like, well, for me it means this, but for others it means something else. There's not just one true and only way to do this. Of course, we're complex creatures, so one could be a Buddhist and an atheist and a this and a that. It's really not hard and fast lines between them.
Yeah, I will say one striking difference, at least as an American, that I experienced going, at least in Myanmar, is that what it means to sort of confess and say what religious identity you are. There are occasions where you meet someone for the first time where that question is there, but the idea of the need to sort of say, what are you, and place you, doesn't seem as important. I mean, there can be situations where, people might ask, oh, are you Buddhist or you're not Buddhist? I want to know the nature of your interaction here. But the kind of concern for exclusivity is a little bit different there. I mean, another interesting example that I recently encountered is they actually, despite me saying this, they have these identity cards national identity cards that actually write their ethnicity on it as well as their religion. And a few months ago, I was in Yangon and having a conversation with a friend of mine, and I was curious. He brought up his identity card and said, hey, look, have a look at this. And it said that his ethnicity was Hindu and his religion was Buddhist. And then he said, oh, I really like Buddhism. And I knew if but I also like Hinduism. So I just thought, well, why don't I have both on there? So there's a lot of ways.
Creative approach. That's great.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that we can sort of interpret what's happening there, but you'll notice that there are these complexities of fluidity involved, and there are certain moments where people get more concerned, I'd say. So when you have these like moments of violence, I think there's a sort of greater urge for a need to sort of confess your affiliation. But my own experience, living there from 2005 to 2008, before a lot of this, most of the new upsurge really happened, these questions weren't very present.
Yeah, I wonder if you could explore a little bit something you alluded to earlier on the distinction between being with Muslims and Indians. There was something there that was a little more nuanced. I'm wondering if you could unpack that a bit.
Yeah, this is hard to explain because I'm still trying to understand it myself. My own impression is that there also isn't really an answer to this. It's more like we have a problem or a dynamic, I should say, of an ambiguous space. So there's this term that's being used in my own experience most often to refer to this person who is this non-Buddhist religious other, often Muslim. And the term itself is a sort of derogatory term associated with the person with a South Asian descent. So there's essentially a kind of racial component. It's a bit unclear where the history of this term emerges from, but you can also see within the earlier 20th century that this term was being evoked in a context where there was a lot of anti-Indian sentiment in the country, and it was seen that way. It's unclear the extent to which religion was important. It was a sort of lumping of both Hindus, Muslims, and mostly Hindus and Muslims, potentially Sikhs and others, Christians as well. But because the resentment against how many of the persons from India were placed in positions of higher authority in the British administration, and the Burmese said, hey, why is it that we aren't getting these positions too? So you have this particular derogatory term that's associated with a sort of racial category. Now, with all this contemporary anti-Muslim sentiment, and there's no, at least to my knowledge, specific problem with the Hindu community. People are using this racial term. So then the idea is that, like, if you say this term, person of South Asian descent, they must be Muslim. So there's a sort of conflation of these terms. And there are other terms that also sort of enter the mix too. People call them Bengali. Just a kind of another kind of a story to tell that maybe is illustrative of this dynamic. Another friend of mine on this topic of identity cards was explaining to me how he had applied for a national identity card and wrote Muslim as his religion and wrote Myanmar as his ethnicity. And then he got it back, and then it said Muslim as his religion, and then his ethnicity said Pakistani. And for him, he's like, I'm not Pakistani. I've been here for generations. But then his rendition or his explanation for what he thought happened to him was that he said, well, a Muslim can't really belong here, so I can't have a Myanmar identity. And if I'm going to be a Muslim, I have to have a kind of ethnic category that's associated with the place that's elsewhere. So then you start to see that there's this really complicated conflation between religion, ethnicity, and also even a sort of national affiliation, whether you belong within the country and you're a true citizen or you're an outsider. And this is sort of where you can see these conditions of part of another dynamic of this conflict is that it's not just that we don't like Muslims, but it's also that these people don't deserve to live here. They're outsiders. This is a question of citizenship. So some people are actually expressing this anti-Muslim sentiment in terms of legalistic terms, saying like, "Hey, they're not citizens. They shouldn't be here." And the international media, has featured this Rohingya community that's in Western Burma, and they've been suffering for much longer than the recent events that I described. But essentially, there's a lot of confusion and interchange between these categories. Some people use them with discipline, and others don't. But then it has this kind of implication that if you're associating things like race and religion, that you see someone and you already know what they are. And you can imagine that when it comes to these events of riots, people aren't going around and saying, all right, what religion are you? All right, now I know I'm going to beat you up. People don't even ask. So Hindus are actually terrified in this because they're like, hey, I look like I have South Asian descent. I'm worried that if there's some anti-Muslim protest, then I'm going to get beat up because they're just going to think I'm a Muslim because I look like this.
So what in your opinion, and bearing in mind it's a very complex issue, what's the prognosis? What's going to happen with this particular interpretation of medicine?
It's really hard to say. I think there's been some enthusiasm to embrace a strategy that essentially identifies everyone affiliated with these organizations and the way that they're espousing a certain kind of hate speech, and carry out some kind of systematic measure to punish, quell, restrain, whatever you want to call it. It may be the case that may have some effects. My own sense is that it's not going to solve the problem because the problem is much deeper. This is sort of the ignition. These things are being ignited by these stimuli. So in a sense, even if you were to eliminate these organizations, there's some deeper ways of speaking and ways of imagining the community as essentially Buddhist, such that their own cultural and historical identities are really essentially tied to that. So there's these other sort of deeper things. So then that would lead you to move into these kinds of directions of saying, are all of our national monuments going to be Buddhist monuments? Again, these are kinds of religious sites that are associated with our national identity, or the way that we tell our own history. And so much of the history is associated with Buddhism. Everybody goes to public schools. So essentially it means like to be a part of this country's history is to be a part of a lineage. So, so some countries who've also had this other problem have taken measures to, adopt the development of pluralism. So actually another interesting site where this could intervene is like the calendar. So it's not just Buddhist holidays, but they try to show some kind of pluralism. And then also in school to say, well, let's see how, certain kinds of figures have been there. So there's a sense of saying like, well, let's have these kinds of identities promoted and a kind of way that they're a part of this community too. So another way of describing it's the development of a sense of community, or I don't know if nationalism is the right term, but a sense of belonging in the country that's not restricted to Buddhism, or if it is restricted to Buddhism, a Buddhism that's defined in such a way that's not exclusive of certain kinds of populations, which has been the case in other moments in history. Now, there's one other thing. So these are the kinds of reforms that I think that seem to be gesturing towards a sort of political institutional level. So something the government would do. Laws are obviously another one. As I mentioned, the laws that were introduced by Mabata, two of them have actually been accepted and put into law. So this is about regulating marriages and conversion. So these kinds of things, I think, are actually creating conditions for this to persist. So obviously, undoing them or making something different would be helpful. But another sort of complicated dynamic is that, Myanmar is making this political transition into becoming a democracy. And it is turning to other places in the world where, it can find leadership and guidance for how to move forward. And one of the things that I've noticed happening with the news media is that, that what they do is to develop, an institution, the civil society institution is, they turn to the West and they model their own practices. And they even to the extent that they're on the internet, just looking up, news stories from whatever journal and then translating them into Burmese, and that sort of becomes the news. Now, one of the things that has been noticed by a number of observers of the current conflict is that these guys are getting all of this news from Western media institutions that are also Islamophobic, or constitute like an idea of Islam that's based on a kind of unitary, global, threatening force. So, in fact, one of the most interesting things is if you go around and again, you talk to someone and they say, like, okay, I'm afraid of Muslims or I have some kind of anti-Islamic sentiment. And then if you have this conversation to say, okay, what kinds of experiences have you had such that you have that feeling? They'll say things like, well, this event in the world. And 99% of the things they cite are going to be international incidents. And this is streaming through the arms of our own media to this country. So there's this kind of interesting, and I imagine that Myanmar is not the only case where this is happening, but there's also this other sort of side of things where it's like, they have this problem. But then there's also like, well, we are involved in this problem. We don't even know it. So it might even be something like the implications of us being, certain kinds of citizens interacting with our own media in the United States could have far-reaching effects to places like Burma.
You're right. It's interesting because the stories that come up are the sensationalized ones, and usually the negative ones grab the most attention. We don't see a great deal of media attention to more positive stories that are occurring of mixing communities and how they can be mutually supportive. I see more people online on Facebook, for example, going out of their way to post these as just a small effort to push back against this tidal wave of really unpleasant, bad things that are happening in the world, and not to tone those down because they're real. We need to know about them, but also to show that that's not all there is in the world. And you're right, this may be having an effect that we really were not considering.
That's right. That's right. And actually, I'll just add to your comments too, because it's another interesting detail that I think one of the things that maybe has radically shifted how people are talking about this is that cell phones have only come out in the country in the past few years. Prior to maybe 5 or 6 years ago, it cost about $3,000 to own a cell phone. Now it's been radically reduced. It's pretty much universally accessible, and everyone's on Facebook. And now it's very easy to circulate any negative images. So, I mean, I observe a number of my monastic friends, and they're constantly circulating these images that are raising alarm. And this is even faster than the news stories because people just say, "Oh, look, this monk got attacked," or "Look at how this a Muslim in Saudi Arabia engaged in this act of violence. How horrific is this? I can't see their humanity." And for that, they don't even have to have any kind of translation process I was describing before. It's like instantaneous circulation of imagery. And of course, that has a sort of strong effect on people. And again, but these are the kinds of infrastructure that we're introducing. And of course, things like Facebook can be actually used as a force of good in just the way you're describing, that people could go out of their way to post something positive. And then we also see the reverse. So, I guess there's just a lot of questions for me. There are things that have to happen on the institutional end of things in the country in terms of moving forward. But then I also see, the presence of my own country over there. And I say, well, maybe I'm supposed to be doing something here. There's this really beautiful story about a friend of mine. And essentially he's a part of a Muslim family in an area that's actually really anti-Muslim. And during one of these riot events, a group of people had approached his house, and then they were going to go there, and they say, "Oh, no, you don't touch them. They're Buddhists." And why that happened was that the grandfather of this family, who had since passed away, about 30 years earlier, he was taking photos at a ordination ceremony, and there was a girl who was crying, who said, "I really want to ordain, but I can't afford it." And then he said, "I'll pay for it." And he paid for it. She ordained, and she became this really well-respected nun in the community, and then celebrated that the act of this human being, not a Buddhist, not a Muslim, this person made possible my entire monastic career. And then it sort of introduced a complexity to the community to say, well, maybe we don't know what's behind some of these faces that we're so readily associating with, race and identity and threat and this sort of thing. So there's so many nice stories like that too.
From one small act of kindness.
That's right. And remembering it too. I mean, that's the thing that's so beautiful too, because it was by people who weren't involved. They say, "I remember this beautiful act of kindness," and I wasn't even there.
3 decades ago.
That's right. But there actually is some interesting conversation to be had about secularism in this conflict, because some people have proposed it as like what we need is a kind of more robust notion of secularism, such that people are not putting Buddhism in this place of nationhood and expectations of citizenship. So like having a secular space for a kind of national citizenship identity would be one way of securing it. But yeah, I would say that secularism doesn't exist in this country, at least not in a robust way. So then it's an interesting question, maybe for you guys, to say, all right, no secularism there. What are we going to do?
What do we do?
That's right.
Our guest today, Charles Carstens. If you'd like to find out more, I will be linking to his Harvard page. Charlie, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks a lot, Ted. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.